Good morning. It is wonderful to see everyone this morning. Glad we can be here to worship God together. We began a series last week titled, How Can I Relate? We didn't say who we were talking about relating to last week because we wanted to talk about the concept of relating to people. How we defined it, if you remember, we talked about two basic elements that, for our purposes at least, are part of relating to people. The first is finding common ground. Believe it or not, with anyone, we are able to find common ground if we look hard enough. At the most basic level, we all are human beings, and we can find common ground in some way in that, but there's usually plenty of other ways that we can find common ground. The second aspect of relating to people is the idea of ultimately showing them that we care. We care about them. We care about what is important to them. We care about who they are in relation to God and what we can do to help them have the right relationship to God. All those aspects ultimately come together in those two ways specifically in relating to people. And we talked about how if we want to teach people, if we want to share the gospel message, we need to relate to people. We must relate to people, in fact, if we want to be effective. Now, are there ways perhaps that we might be able to get the message to people and a few people might hear it if even we're not trying to relate to them? Maybe. But we're going to turn far more people away if they can tell we're not even trying to connect with them, to relate to them, to find common ground, to show them we care. We're going to turn a lot more people away than we ever convince. Even if what we're saying is true, we need to try and relate. That's what we see Jesus doing. That's what we see the apostles doing. That's what we see everyone really in the New Testament as we see these conversion stories, especially in the book of Acts. They find ways to relate to their audience so that they can be most effective in the spreading of the gospel. So we talked about all that. That's a brief summary of last week. We're going to begin then, for the next several weeks, talking about relating to specific groups of people. And the reason we need to do that is not to establish what relating is in general or why we need to relate, but to address the difficulties that often come with relating to different groups of people, especially those with which we may not be very familiar, those with which we may not have much in common. That's kind of the point, right? It's harder to relate to people who we don't have anything in common. If I know I have a ton in common with someone, well, it's almost effortless to relate to them because I automatically have all these common grounds that I just have found with them. But it's hard to relate to certain groups more than others at times. So we're going to talk this morning as we begin the detailed aspect of this series. How can I relate to someone from a different culture? Now I want to throw a couple of caveats out there as we begin to try and make sure we understand where we're coming from here. In this particular effort that we're going to undertake this morning, we're not so much talking about, just to put it bluntly, racism or the things related to racism. We're not saying, how can I have anything to do with so-and-so of this race or that race? Now, that is a problem in the Lord's church in many places. I hope it's not a problem here. I've never seen it be a problem here. But that is something that is a struggle for the church in different places of the world, racism and things associated with that. That's not really where I want us to focus this morning. What I want us to talk about when we're talking about culture is we're talking about just the differences rather than the just inherent, oh, you are from a different culture, different race, different ethnicity. The differences that make it hard for us to relate because of behavior, because of practice, because of what I'm familiar with that you're not familiar with, and vice versa. So I think this will become more clear as we begin. So let's just go to our first point as we start out here. We're talking about a different culture. We need to understand something. And that is that in any area of life, differences make us uncomfortable. They create some discomfort for us. If something is different, automatically that means it's not what I'm used to. And what I'm not used to is not comfortable, because almost by definition, comfort is I am enjoying what I'm used to in a positive sense. Let's think about some examples. If you go to different places in the world or even encounter people in our own place in the world that are from different cultures, you're going to find different kinds of food that are eaten. Now, Melissa and I enjoy watching a certain YouTube channel that a lot of what they do is taste different foods, and sometimes it's different foods from around the world. They tasted a lot of different things. There are some things that I would love to try and taste. There are some things that sound disgusting. If you know what haggis is, I don't ever want to put haggis in my mouth. It sounds awful. I'll give you a hint. It's a lot of intestines and organs involved in the making of haggis. To some people, that is normal. Not just normal, that is a delicacy. That's delicious. That's strange to me because it's different. And that would make me uncomfortable if someone set a plate of haggis in front of me. Or let's take different cultures in terms of their, personal space and politeness type practices. If you go to China, I talked with an elder in the church a while back, and I say a while back, like several years ago. He went to China several times for business and different things like that. And when he was in China, something that he told me that really stood out to him that was different from the United States. They have a lot of people in China. Now, we might think, if you go to Dallas or something like that, there's a lot of people. No. You don't understand. They have a lot of people in China. Like, it is ridiculous how crowded the cities in China are. Because of that, and some other cultural practices as well, they don't really do lines. What I mean is, if you're trying to get in an elevator, usually you would think, a few people are waiting in the elevator, you let them go first, and then you go, and then all that kind of stuff. Or if you're at the cash register or something, they don't do that. You just try and get in, and everyone just kind of presses together, and whoever manages to get in first gets in. Now, that may be an oversimplification depending on where you go, but at least where this gentleman was when he was in China, that's just the way it works. No one thinks of it as being impolite. That's just the practical nature of having so many people. You do your best to get where you need to go, and there's a lot of other people trying to get there too oftentimes. Or maybe we think about practices as it relates to the social type aspect. Talking to another individual who had spent a lot of time in an Eastern European country, and the degree to which talking is not a thing just floored me. Meaning, like, if a bunch of people are in a room together, it's so much quieter than I would ever be comfortable with. That's just the norm. In fact, depending on the situation, sometimes maybe a couple people might be talking, but everyone else is just dead silent. Now, when, let's say 6 of us get together in a room, we're all having conversations, right? Usually there's 3 or 4 different conversations going on in that mix. That's not how it is there. In fact, if you talk, as opposed to maybe 1 or 2 other people, if you're talking, that's kind of considered rude. You're supposed to be quiet and sit there and, whatever. Well, that's different. That would make me uncomfortable to be in that situation. Or we could throw another one out there that's kind of uncomfortable. You go to a lot of places. For example, I've talked to a lot of missionaries who've gone to Central and South America. Let's just put it this way. Women with young children will just start breastfeeding. No blanket, no cover, no anything. It just happens. And especially people who aren't used to that, they're like, whoa, what's going on, right? This is a very, very uncomfortable situation. In their culture, there's nothing at all that is inappropriate, that's just who would be in any way offended by that? You're feeding a child, right? But to us, that would be kind of maybe even borderline offensive, if not at least very unusual. All these kinds of things, these are differences that might make us a little bit uncomfortable. If people don't wait in line, if people give me really strange food, if all these different things, that would make me uncomfortable. Let's think about an example from Scripture as we're thinking about this idea of differences making us uncomfortable. The Samaritan woman at the well. She's there drawing water as Jesus has been sitting by the well. His disciples have gone to get food, and he asks her for a drink. There's something we need to understand about that occasion, that thing that just happened there. That doesn't happen in their culture. He has done something by asking this woman for water that is completely different from anything that would be acceptable from a cultural perspective for them. Number one, it's a man speaking to a woman in a more or less public setting. That's not okay. For another thing, it's a Jew speaking to a Samaritan. They don't have anything to do with each other. There's all sorts of reasons why this isn't culturally right. And yet, that's what happens. There's this level of discomfort that's there because something's different from what everyone in the situation is used to just by nature of the culture that they're in. So I want us to think about that as we begin this discussion. I should expect If I go into a situation where I know I'm going to be interacting with someone from a different culture, and by the way, I can think of at least 3 or 4 different types of cultures you and I probably interact with fairly frequently, and may not really think of it that way because they're all in America, but they're different cultures nonetheless. I should expect some discomfort when I encounter another culture. Not because there's anything wrong with them or wrong with me, just because it's not what I'm used to. I should expect to be a little uncomfortable. That means I have work to do on myself. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. That doesn't mean I have work to do on myself in the sense of, oh, I should make this something I do too. I don't have to. It's fine, usually speaking. And we'll talk about that more in a second. What I mean is, if I'm going to try and reach someone who is from another culture, that means I need to expect and work on my discomfort so that doesn't become an obstacle in my trying to build a relationship so I can share the gospel. If I'm uncomfortable, or if I know, let's put it that way, that something is going to be uncomfortable, what is my natural inclination? If I know something is going to be uncomfortable, I'm going to try and avoid it. But if someone of another culture needs the gospel, I don't get to just try and avoid that. So instead, I've got to work on the fact that I know this is going to be uncomfortable so I can move forward anyway. But let's think of something else. And this is something that, unfortunately, we don't always do a good job of recognizing. And that is that culture is often morally neutral. Now, here's what we mean by that. The different practices of different cultures, the different ways they behave, the different ways they interact, a lot of those aspects that make us different from a cultural perspective aren't either right or wrong. Now, are there things that are different between cultures that are matters of right and wrong? Yes. For example, are there religious practices that are embedded in certain cultures that are inherently right or wrong because Scripture says those are right or wrong? Yes. But I would argue that the vast majority of differences between cultures aren't either right or wrong. They're just different from what we're used to. Let's use our examples that we talked about. Is it wrong to eat haggis? I mean, my digestive system might say yes, but in terms of morally, no. Is it wrong to not have lines? Now, we might say, well, it's impolite. Impolite by whose standard? Do I need to be polite? Yes. But who determines what is and isn't polite when it comes to having a line or not having a line? I'm sorry, but that's cultural. That's not a right or wrong thing. There's nothing wrong with being in a culture where there are no lines. Let me use another example just to throw this out there. This one really, especially for us in kind of Western American culture, this can kind of really blow our minds, and I didn't think to put this one up there. In many countries, it is considered a mark of respect for those who have authored books to quote them in the books without any kind of citation or reference. Now, what do we call that? That's plagiarism. That's inherently morally wrong in the way that we have thought about that. But why? It's because of the standards we have created culturally. For them, it's not morally wrong because instead of me trying to pass off someone else's work as my own, for them, this is, I am showing respect to those who have gone before, who have thought through these things. Now, if they were trying to pass off work as their own, if that was the intent, well, that's different, but that's not the intent in those cultures. In fact, there are a lot of people from certain countries who have come to some of the universities, even universities I've attended that I've talked to some of the professors about, they've told me these stories. It's very difficult to try and convey this concept to them because for them, based on their standards of academics, they can't allow plagiarism, but they also have to be very gentle with some of these people because they know that there's no ill intent there. They're not trying to do something wrong. That's just how they grew up understanding this was okay to do. All the examples we talked about, ultimately, I would argue, none of them are matters of right and wrong. It's just that in our culture, if we're talking about, would I do this in our culture? No, because it would be considered rude. But inherently, it's just a difference. The one who observes the day, Paul says in Romans chapter 14, observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord. Now, Let's think about what he's saying in Romans chapter 14 for a moment. This is a passage in Romans that is talking about people having different mindsets of certain things that are okay or not okay to do. Now, granted, he's talking in a religious context. Things like eating meat sacrificed to idols, not eating meat sacrificed to idols. Celebrating a day that was once a religious holiday, not celebrating a day that was once a religious holiday. And you realize what he's saying here. He's saying, number one, a lot of these things no longer should be seen as religiously binding, meaning it's not necessarily wrong to eat meat sacrificed to idols or right to eat meat sacrificed to idols. It's meat. That's Paul's argument throughout all of his writings. That's no longer something that's a matter of right and wrong. Celebrating a day, not celebrating a day. It's no longer a matter of right and wrong. Notice what he says. What matters is your mindset when you do it. So you realize what he's just said there. These things have become cultural things. Honoring the day or observing the day, a Gentile would never think to do something like that in terms of, for example, the Jewish days of celebration. A Gentile wouldn't do that, a Gentile Christian, but a Jewish Christian might still want to do that. Paul's saying that's not a religious difference, that's not a moral difference, that's now just a cultural difference. And the one shouldn't judge the other or vice versa based on culture. In other words, it's morally neutral. I've become all things to all people, Paul said. We talked about this even last week. That by all means I might save some. Now he's not saying, I become a worshiper of Baal to those who worship Baal, so that I can by all means save those who worship Baal. No. He's not saying that. So what all things is he becoming to all people? Well, he actually explains it. We don't have time to read the whole thing, but basically he says, I became like a Jew to Jews. I became like a Greek to Greeks. I became like one who follows the old law to those who follow the old law. I became as one who doesn't have the old law to those who don't have the old law. He's not talking about anything that's matters of right and wrong. He's saying on everything that wasn't matter of right and wrong, I tried to conform to the culture of those I was with. In other words, I tried to relate to them so that I could reach them better. There's a lot of things that might make us uncomfortable when it comes to differences in culture. But Paul gives us an example. He says, if it's not a matter of right and wrong, and we need to think very hard about whether or not it actually is or not, if it's not a matter of right and wrong, you would do well to try and conform to the culture of someone else if you're trying to reach them, because that'll make it easier for you to share the gospel. Some cultural practices, yes, are specifically moral issues. I'll give a quick example. There is a practice in some areas of Africa to do with the sexual ethics of young men coming up, growing up into adolescence, that involve blatant immorality. That's not acceptable, because that is explicitly mentioned, that's explicitly regulated in Scripture. But that's the exception. Most cultural practices are not moral issues of right and wrong. They're simply culture. And we as Christians need to know the difference. There are a lot of Christians who don't. And I'll just leave it at that. Also, we need to remember, as we talk about the struggles that we sometimes encounter when we're trying to relate to those other cultures, it goes both ways. Meaning, yes, sometimes we find what other cultures do kind of uncomfortable. Sometimes we might even be tempted at first, knee-jerk reaction, to think what they're doing isn't right, when in fact it's just different. It goes both ways. If you talk to people who don't live in the United States, you know one of the first things they will tell you, and there's a long list, by the way, but I'm just using one example. You know one of the first things they'll tell you that's strange about Americans? They say, y'all are obsessed with your flag. And just your country in general. Like, what's up with that? Like, there are American flags everywhere. There's all this stuff, and people are so proud to be American. Like, that's just strange to a lot of people. Like, yeah, they like their country. Most people, right? They like their country. They like living there. They're happy to be whatever nationality they are. But we're kind of obsessive about it in the eyes of other people. Now, Is it wrong to display an American flag and to be more in tune with showing our patriotism and stuff like that? It's not necessarily wrong. Is it wrong not to be as blatant about our patriotism? No, it's not wrong either. It's different. We have to remember, for everything that we see in someone else who is from a different culture that we find strange about them, there's something they find strange about us. Usually the opposite, right? For example, if someone from China comes over here and sees us waiting in lines, they're like, man, this is a waste of time. What on earth are you all doing? Just go. It's strange. I want us to think for a minute about the wording that Paul uses in Colossians 3. He's talking about the church. Beautiful statement about the church. He says, here in the church, there is not Greek or Jew. What is that? Well, that's ethnicity, yes, but it's also culture. There is not Greek nor Jew. There is not circumcised or uncircumcised. Again, differences in culture, differences in practice. But then notice this next part. Barbarian, Scythian, slave or free. But Christ is all and in all. I want us to talk about that word barbarian for just a moment. When you and I think of the word barbarian, is it a positive or a negative word? Or maybe let me put it this way. If someone were to call you a barbarian, would you be offended or would you just, oh, okay? I think I'd be offended. Let me tell you how that word came to be. Greeks and Latins, and I say maybe Greeks and Romans, Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking peoples in the Mediterranean world in ancient times, especially around the time of Christ, a little bit before that. They believed they had a great culture. They believed, in fact, their culture was very advanced, very superior to those around them. And so because they believed they have this superior culture, which by the way was steeped in idolatry, but nonetheless, they believe they have this very superior culture. As they begin to interact with those who are not Greek, and of course the Romans stole a lot of the Greek culture, so Greek or Roman, as they begin to interact with those who are not Greco-Roman, they said, well, y'all are, you're whatever, but you're not Greek. You're different. And they tried to speak with these cultures, but of course they didn't speak the same language. The word barbarian, as best as we can tell, literally comes from a word that the Greeks made up that's basically barbarian. That's literally what they did. It is an insult in its very nature of the word. In other words, they're saying, well, you don't speak the same language as us, so you're right? And even today, ironically, when people make movies and tell stories that are set in like the Greek or Roman period, they often tend to portray anyone who's not Greek or Roman as uncivilized. They usually had just as advanced of a civilization as the Greeks and the Romans. They just didn't have the same practices, didn't have the same language. And so they're barbarians. And yet, here's Paul saying, no, we're not doing that. Greek, Jew, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarians, Scythians. Scythians, by the way, are some of the people on the very outskirts of the known world. We're all one in Christ. We're not going to do that. Oh, but we're Greek-speaking Jew, or Greek-speaking Christians, rather, or we're Jewish. We were once God's people. No, we're not doing that. We're not doing this, oh, I'm civilized, you're a barbarian. No. We're Christians. And when we're trying to reach people, it's easy for us because, I'm sorry, but America does this sometimes too. We're Americans, you're the rest of the world. We do that sometimes. We need to be very careful that when we're trying to reach people with the gospel, we don't come into that with the mindset of, oh, let me as an educated American with a superior culture tell you what you need to know about the gospel. No. They think that we're backwards, just like we think they're backwards in some ways. We need to remember, just as Paul points out here, those differences shouldn't be at the forefront of our identity as Christians. Others will find my culture just as strange as I find theirs. That means I have even more work to do to try and relate. I'm the one who needs, because I have the gospel to share with others, I have this message that everyone needs to hear. I need to be the one who's willing to put forth the work. Usually, the other person, if I'm trying to convert someone to Christ, usually the other person doesn't really have a whole lot at stake that's going to push them to try and relate to me, which means the burden's on me to do the work, to try and relate, to try and bridge that gap of culture, in this case, to relate. But it's worth it. Now, we talked about a lot of difficulties this morning, a lot of things that make it harder for us to relate to people of different cultures as we're trying to share the gospel message with them. But here's what we have to remember when we're talking about this issue. We're all human beings. Every single one of us, and I don't mean us in this room, or us in this state, or us in this country, every single one of us were made in the image of God as human beings with an eternal spirit that will last beyond this life. And every other difference of language, of culture, of race, of whatever, if that colors my view of someone else, yeah, they're human, but no, can't go there. That's a human being. That's a being made in the image of God that needs what I have been blessed to be taught to them. And I haven't been taught that because I'm any better than they are. I've been taught that simply because I've been blessed to be taught by someone else who probably saw me in the same way that I might see this other person. And so I need to extend to them the same courtesy, the same gift that has once been extended to me. Truly, I understand, Peter says, as he is speaking to a Roman, which he's not supposed to be speaking to by cultural standards. Truly, I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Now, we often quote that passage, as I said, in terms of things like racism. That's the extreme. But we need to think of this in broader terms. God doesn't care that I'm an American. God doesn't care that I'm a Texan. Oh, I'm proud in that sense to be a Texan, to be an American. But in terms of what really matters, God couldn't care less. God cares that I'm a human being that needs to be trying to mold my life to be like his son. And he cares that I want to extend that to everyone that I am able to reach equally. In every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable. There's neither Jew nor Greek, Paul says in Galatians. Neither slave nor free, no male or female, you are all one in Christ. If I'm going to relate to those in different culture, and again, we encounter a lot here in this country. We say, oh, we're all Americans, but there's different subcultures that are very different from ours. We need to have this mindset if we're going to reach them. We need to be willing, as Paul was, to become all things to all men when it comes to culture and language and things like that, to whatever degree it's possible for us to do, because their soul matters that much. In spite of our differences, there are always similarities. That's the common ground that we talked about. There's always common ground, at the very least, because we're both human. And we each have that soul. And that's why we should care. Common ground and a reason to care. That's what relating is all about. Is it difficult? Yes. There's a lot of things that I feel awkward about when I try to talk to someone from a different culture. It's difficult at times. But that's what we're called to do. I must love others enough to overcome the discomforts and misunderstandings, in this case, that come with differences in culture, and build on what we have in common. Something that I really enjoyed, I might have shared this with y'all before, but one day every week, y'all may or may not know, the school at Brown Trail, they have a Hispanic school as well as an English school. So there is a Spanish-speaking program that is separate, has a separate director and everything, and then there's the English-speaking program. And once every week, I believe it's on a Wednesday, unless things have changed, we have a combined chapel. Now, most of the Spanish-speaking guys can't speak English, and most of us gringos can't speak Spanish. But we have traveled together. We'll sing in English, they'll sing in Spanish. Someone will give whatever the talker, whatever it is, in English, and someone else will translate in Spanish, or vice versa. It's kind of uncomfortable sometimes because I don't really know how to talk to people that can't speak my language. It's hard for me to find ways to communicate. I can shake their hand, I can smile, that's a starting point. It's also easy for there to be things sometimes that I try and communicate and maybe it not be understood, but I love that they do that at the school. Because it reminds us that despite all the differences that may exist, we're all trying for the same thing. We're all working to the same goal. And ultimately, those differences don't matter, or they shouldn't. So I hope this encourages us this morning. We're going to continue this series next week with another discussion along these lines. But I hope that this is something that will be on our hearts and our minds as we move forward this week. If there is any way that we can help you, to encourage you, to pray for you this morning, or if there is someone here who has not obeyed the gospel and wants to learn more about this message that we have to share with everyone, please let us know so we can help as we stand and sing together.
Zion's call
Sweetly rings over land and